Hi everyone, and welcome to this ASA webinar on trauma-informed archives. We want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners across Australia to whom land was never ceded, or the traditional owners of the land you are watching from today. So I'm Nicola, and this is Kirsten.
Hi everyone.
This is the first in a series of webinars being put on by the Australian Society of Archivists for Information Awareness Month, and they are being recorded. So this presentation was recorded as a standalone presentation in early April. So when we'd recently gone into lockdown and it was not clear how long it would last or how lasting the effects and impacts would be. We're not going to say much up front now because we do introduce ourselves in the video and we talk more about the topic and what it's going to include in that. So the format of this session is that we'll play the recording. It goes for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to come back for a live Q&A. You can ask questions throughout the webinar using the question box on the side, and we'll use this to frame our Q&A session. So feel free to ask your questions throughout the video, and you can add them at the end as well. If there are lots of questions and we don't have time to get to them all, we'll collate them and respond to them in a document that can be hosted on the ASA website, and we'll send that out to you at the end. So we'll get started with the video. Thanks for joining us.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation titled Trauma-Informed Archives. This presentation is based on the online course that we have developed for the Australian Society of Archivists called A Trauma-Informed Approach to Managing Archives. We wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we live and work on, the people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land across Australia, no matter where you may be watching this from. This presentation gives a high-level introduction to trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed archival practice, and vicarious trauma. It will get you thinking about what you can do in your organisation to move towards having a trauma-informed archive. So we want to introduce ourselves so you know who we are, where we're coming from, and to position ourselves in this discussion. So we both work on the Find and Connect web resource. For those who don't know about Find and Connect, it provides information about out-of-home care in Australia, and it links together the histories of institutions who provided care with the archival records created by those institutions, how the records can be accessed, and key events and legislation impacting on the history of out-of-home care in Australia. We don't hold any records ourselves. Instead, we point to where they are, who holds them, and how people can get access to them. Find and Connect is a broader program than just the web resource, however, and it also includes support services in each state, which people who grew up in out-of-home care can access. It was through those support services that we were introduced to the model of trauma-informed practice and concepts such as vicarious trauma, and we saw their applicability within the archive sphere. So I'm Kirsten, and I'm the program manager for the web resource. I've worked in both records management and archives positions in universities and at the Public Record Office Victoria. I'm very interested in ideas of language and archival description, and I think that our trauma-informed archival practice is a really useful model through which we can consider our professional practice and how it can be improved for everyone.
Hi, I'm Nicola, and I'm the Senior Project Archivist for the web resource, and I'm also the Vice President of the Australian Society of Archivists. Trauma-informed archival practice has been a focus for me in recent years, in particular raising awareness of the effects of vicarious trauma and emotional labour, and the need for resources to support people within the archival profession. I see trauma-informed archival practice as a model to put the focus on people within archives, ensuring best practice access regimes and supporting everyone who works and uses the archives. As Kirsten mentioned, this presentation is based on the online course, A Trauma-Informed Approach to Managing Archives. The course is now available, and near the end we've got information about how you can access it and what other resources are available. We're going to introduce you to the key concepts and principles of trauma-informed practice and expand these to cover trauma-informed archival practice. We will talk about issues of vicarious trauma and how that affects archivists. We will discuss some ways to implement trauma-informed practice into your archives now, and depending on how your archives operates, this will include actions you can take while working from home. Before we go any further, we want to put some caveats and disclaimers up front. The concept of trauma-informed practice comes from the healthcare world, where it was first used by mental health professionals working one-on-one with clients who had experienced trauma. We do not have a background in mental health, and we are not experts in this field. Second, language and framing. We are using words like trauma and trauma-informed, as these words are commonly used and people can identify what is being covered and what words to use if they want to search for more material. However, for some, framing issues in terms of trauma has negative connotations, and identifying someone as traumatized may result in people being pathologized. This is not our intention. We also want to acknowledge that this language may not be the most accurate for an archival setting. These are new terms and concepts for most archivists, so hopefully in time, more specific and useful words can be used. These discussions, and particularly discussions around vicarious trauma, may cause feelings of sadness or distress, or make you think of times when you experienced trauma. If you need to stop and take a break, that is absolutely fine and very normal. This is probably particularly the case at the moment.
So what is trauma-informed practice? Trauma is pervasive and affects us all. Many of us would have experienced trauma ourselves or know of loved ones who have experienced trauma. Particularly when trauma is experienced in childhood, this can lead to lifelong and serious effects. Trauma-informed practice is a strengths-based approach which can be put into practice in any context and works to reduce the likelihood of stressful interactions and the effects of any previous trauma. Trauma-informed practice acknowledges that every interaction someone has, no matter how large or small, may be positive or negative. Positive interactions of all kinds can help us heal. Negative interactions may make healing further out of reach and make existing emotional and psychological problems worse. Achieving trauma-informed practice involves collaborating with people who've experienced trauma, determining their needs, understanding the environments, behaviours and inputs that may be triggering for them, and from there developing strategies to avoid re-traumatising them. Importantly, trauma-informed practice also provides a safe space for all who may be affected by the reliving of traumatic events or the discovery of challenging material. While trauma-informed practice came out of the healthcare space, it can be applied in a variety of contexts. It is not about changing what services your organisation provides, but how those services are provided. And it's also important to note that trauma-informed practice does not replace any therapeutic approaches or one-on-one support by a healthcare practitioner.
Trauma-informed practice is based on the 5 principles of safety, trust and transparency, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. We will go through each of these now, and then we'll move on to discussing what implementing these principles in an archive setting may mean. Safety is the most important and is the foundation on which the other principles sit. This is because if someone is not safe, the other principles do not matter. Safety refers to physical, emotional, and cultural safety. It also means that staff need to feel safe at their work. Trust and transparency means doing what you say you will do and explaining why you are doing it. It may also mean being open about when you can't do something too. Trust may take a long time to develop, and acting in a consistent and transparent manner goes a long way in building that trust. Choice means, wherever possible, tailoring the service you provide so that it is driven by the person's choices, so it is most appropriate for them. In line with trust and transparency, it also means being open when no choices are available and a process must be done in a specified way. The principle of choice means being upfront about all the options that are available, even if some options are less convenient to you or your organisation. Collaboration is a key principle, and it represents a shift in the way you may do your work. Rather than working for someone, the principle of collaboration means you instead work with someone. This is because a fundamental tenet of trauma-informed practice is to recognise that the people you are assisting are equal partners in the process. While you may have specific subject matter expertise, they are the experts in their own lives and what is best for them. On an organisational level, the principle of collaboration also means including people from affected communities on your advisory or governance boards so that they can help ensure your organisation is best meeting their community's needs. Empowerment means acknowledging and validating someone's skills and strengths and utilising these as part of your collaboration with them. Again, this can be done on both an individual and an organisational scale. Through application of the other trauma-informed principles, people can feel empowered and affirmed, leading to more positive interactions and more healing.
So these are the basic principles that underpin trauma-informed practice, but what does this mean for archives? Considering again that trauma-informed practice is about ensuring positive interactions for all and looking at how an organisation provides its services, what could be done to implement these principles in archives? The second part of the course covers information about how these may work for archives. We all know that archives contain important and key records for individuals and communities, which may provide information about their identities and histories, why certain events have happened, or to make sense of their pasts. People can find the process of having to access information held by institutions very challenging, particularly when that information is about them, their families, or communities. In some cases, the organisations holding the records may be the same organisations who have caused them harm in the past. Archives can be intimidating places. The buildings may be intimidating. This photo on the slide is of the National Archives in the USA. Processes involved in accessing archives may be intimidating, the language and jargon used, and not knowing if the person handling their request is trustworthy. These can all have a significant and negative impact on those who've experienced trauma. In addition, people may have had negative experiences in the past when trying to access records, and therefore may be distrustful when approaching an archive. Implementing the principles of trauma-informed practice can, over time, help alleviate this distrust and ensure that people get access to relevant records in a safe and empowering way. So this section of the toolkit goes into a lot more detail of topics for you to consider and small things you can start to do in your organisation to begin implementing elements of trauma-informed practice. But we wanted you as a starting point to go away and have a think about this question. What do these principles mean for your archives? One thing to emphasise is that while an archives reference service is an obvious place where trauma-informed practice can be implemented, that's where you're dealing with people one-on-one, but trauma-informed practice can be implemented everywhere. So for example, in relation to the building, you might want to consider first impressions. Is it clear where people need to go and what they need to do? What about your signage? Does it make sense to people who are not used to dealing with archives? Are there places in your building that people can go to step away from the records and have some quiet time if they're feeling distressed or upset? Consider how you can better work with the communities representing in the records you hold to improve archival description or finding aids. Are you connected in with local relevant community bodies? If not, this is a good place to start. Providing access to records is an important process which you can view through a trauma-informed lens. For example, how are the records provided? Do you ask the person how they wish to receive them? Are records sent out in the post with no warning? Do you provide high quality colour copies of records? Some people may also be eligible for assistance with the records access process, for example, through LinkUp or through the Find and Connect support services. It can be useful to provide information about these services as part of your records access processes. This is just the tip of the iceberg, so we encourage you to go away and think about what you could do in your archives. Even if it's something really small, it's still a start.
For many people at the moment, you might be unable to be in your archive and with your physical collections. This doesn't mean that you can't start enacting some of the trauma-informed principles from home. Consider your web presence. If you don't have one, now is the time to start one, even if it is just a single page on your organization's website. A web presence can help build trust in your archive by letting people know that you exist, who you are, and provide a brief overview of your collection. It can also empower people by informing them of the choices they have in when and how they can access your archives. A web presence also provides an important opportunity for you to be transparent and explain what COVID-19 means for you and your archives and what changes have had to be made. If you have digitized items online, it is an important time to remind people that not all the items you have in your archive are available online, and these are only a selection. So to understand the full collection, they might need to access finding aids, contact you, or wait until they can visit in person. Connecting through to social media to promote the archives and connect with users can be another way to keep being open and transparent about what is currently occurring. It can also open up your archive to new users, and it offers people another choice about how to interact with your archive. And you never know, it might even provide opportunities for people to collaborate with you on projects in the future. Talk to users about what is happening and what restrictions you have in place, even if you don't know when you'll be back. While you aren't in the archive, use this time to connect and engage with your users in a way that you wouldn't normally have time for. While you can't work on your physical items, take the time to reconsider any processes and policies your archives use. Are there changes you could make to improve your access process, or a better way to input metadata to improve the language used? Can you update or create cover letters that you use when you release records to improve the language and information included to provide more context about the records? These are just some of the ways that you can implement trauma-informed archival practice into your archives from home. Another element of providing a trauma-informed service is responding to the effects of vicarious trauma that staff may experience in the course of their work. I will now move to the third part of the course, which discusses these issues. Recalling the importance of the first principle of safety, dealing with vicarious trauma involves establishing appropriate boundaries to ensure both staff and users of archives are safe. Vicarious trauma is defined as the changes in one's own sense of self that can occur when one is exposed to traumatic material or to survivors of trauma. Essentially, you may have a trauma reaction by being exposed to someone else's trauma or through exposure to traumatic material. These effects may be amplified if support and management of the symptoms are not provided. It is not a sign of weakness and is instead an entirely normal response to being exposed to trauma. Vicarious trauma has again long been recognised in the health fields. However, it has only recently been introduced in the archives and records space. It is important to note that everyone reacts differently and people have different risk factors which will affect their reactions and responses to exposure to trauma. We are not able to discuss this in this presentation, but in the toolkit, it goes into a lot more detail about the symptoms of vicarious trauma and common responses to traumatic materials.
As we mentioned before, exposure to traumatic material is one way vicarious trauma may be experienced. We all know that archives are full of traumatic material, records documenting human rights abuses or traumatic and discriminatory government policies of the past, for example, the forced removal of children, war records, police and inquest records, disaster responses, surveillance records, so on and so forth. The list is endless. In some cases, the records themselves may not contain obviously traumatic material, but it may be the context in which the records are requested that might bring on trauma. For example, we've heard stories of archivists needing to retrieve records for the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse and experiencing trauma as a result. Sometimes archivists may experience trauma because there are no records, either because of the neglect of records in the past or because of previous disposal practices. The absence of records can also cause trauma, both for the archivist and for the person requesting the records. Some archivists have shared that they do not feel it is their right to feel vicarious trauma. Various reasons have been given, including that they are only interacting with documents, that they themselves weren't directly exposed to a traumatic event, and that people who experience the traumatic events within the records have the right to be traumatized, but not those who read about it. Identifying and acknowledging vicarious trauma does in no way take away from the trauma experienced by others. However, acknowledging the potential for vicarious trauma means that all staff are better prepared when responding to users and providing the best service possible. There is much more material in the toolkit about these issues, including some activities to do if you are exposed to traumatic material, how to help others having a trauma reaction, and checklists of longer-term strategies to deal with vicarious trauma. Something else we want to emphasize is vicarious trauma is an organizational issue in the same way that any other occupational health and safety issue is. Vicarious trauma can often feel quite isolating because individuals all have different reactions and experiences of it, and because it can feel like a response that isn't justified. This is not the case. In the same way that organisations are responsible for implementing trauma-informed practice, they are responsible for keeping their workers safe and supported. We know it isn't possible to ensure that no one ever suffers from vicarious trauma. So instead, organisations should work to best support their workers when issues of vicarious trauma come up. Some things organisations can do is provide training opportunities for staff around issues of vicarious trauma and mental health more broadly. They can enable staff to prioritise self-care, make it clear that self-care is an accepted part of work practice. If possible, workers can be rotated so it's not the same person always having to deal with the same traumatic material. This may not always be possible depending on how many staff are in an archive, but should be considered if it is. And also normalising discussions of mental health and vicarious trauma. Unfortunately, these are still taboo topics in a lot of workplaces and may make people think that they are the only ones feeling a certain way when they're not. We hope this presentation and the online course also shows you that this is not the case and that you are not alone. So this presentation has provided a brief introduction to the topics covered in the course, but to get the most benefit and to fully understand trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed archival practice, vicarious trauma, and what it can mean for you and your archives, we hope that your organisation supports you to take the online course.
A trauma-informed approach to managing archives online course is available now through the ASA's online learning platform. We've gone over some of the key concepts today, but we do encourage you to take the full course. It goes into lots more detail about what archives can do and how they can best assist their staff and users while providing a safe environment for all. The course also has videos with experts. We have Dr. Michelle Noon, who is a psychologist and criminologist and an expert in complex trauma and trauma-informed practice, and Michaela Hart, an archivist at the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria, who assisted with their response to the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse and has worked with me previously on issues of vicarious trauma in archives. The course also contains some quizzes and activities to get you thinking about what you can do in your organisations to start making a move to working in a more trauma-informed way. There's also some tools such as a template for a wellness plan you can download and complete for yourself. You'll also get a certificate of completion when you're done. So there are 2 more courses currently in development for the ASA. The first is an out-of-home care records toolkit designed for anyone who holds records of out-of-home care and discusses why records are so important to people who grew up in out-of-home care. It also includes the record-keeping recommendations coming out of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and steps through providing access to records in a trauma-informed and empathetic way. And we have also developed this toolkit. The other new course is being developed by Kirsten Thorpe and Lauren Booker at Jumbana Institute, University of Technology, Sydney. It focuses on the requirements of Indigenous record keeping and archiving, including discussing the background to collections held by archives and other institutions relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the relevance of protocols and community consultation, and the importance of cultural competency. As you can see, all 3 courses complement each other. The ASA is offering packages if you wish to do more than one of the courses, discounts for members, and also offering bulk purchase options for organisations. And all 3 courses will be available by mid-2020.
So thank you very much for watching this presentation about trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed archival practice, and vicarious trauma. And we really hope you're all staying safe and well in these challenging times. If you do have any questions, you can email us directly. Our details are on the slide. And if you have questions about accessing the course or purchasing those course packages, you can also email the ASA at the address on the slide. We hope this is just the start of the conversation of this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was the end of the presentation that, as Nicola said, we recorded a few weeks ago. And it's interesting to see how much, I guess, things have changed even in this time from when we recorded it originally. We obviously talked about the issues in the presentation around what trauma means for archives and what trauma means for archivists, but it sort of feels like we're in this sort of unprecedented time of trauma for everyone because of the pandemic and because of how things are, and having to deal with working from home and blurring the boundaries between personal life and work life, and obviously challenges around children and childcare and not having support structures that people would otherwise have in place. So I wanted to acknowledge that it's a tough time for everyone, and that might affect your work. It might mean that things that you normally don't have any difficulties doing, you suddenly find triggering, or things that you're not expecting to find triggering are suddenly, quite upsetting. And yeah, obviously, work for a lot of people is difficult at the moment. One issue we've seen online from archivists and others more broadly is not having access to physical collections at the moment for a lot of people. That's obviously really difficult, and also makes it incredibly difficult to talk to users about what you've got or what they can have access to, particularly right now when it's really difficult to know when that might be. But I think that's also a really good opportunity to maybe think about some of those trauma-informed principles and implementing them around how you're communicating with your users around what's available, or what might be available when, or what the difficulties are around accessing those materials. And that's just one quite basic example. It looks like we've got a couple of questions, so we might go to the questions. Nicola, do you have the first one?
Yeah.
There?
So it's a bit of a longer question, but I'll read it out so that we get the full context. So within my own cultural and religious tradition, there are specific prayers and rituals that are recommended by respected cultural leaders as methods for taking care of yourself if you're exposed to distressing records on a regular basis? Would you recommend that archivists from diverse cultural backgrounds draw on their cultural traditions to develop their resilience to vicarious trauma? I guess I'm just going to say yes straight away, definitely. I think you should always draw on your own experiences and your own background and what's going to suit you and how you need to respond. And I guess we talk a little bit more about ways that you can do that in the toolkit, but it is really about working out what suits you. There is no method that's going to suit everyone, and you need to work out what fits for you, your life, the records as well that you're exposed to and the experiences that you're having. But 100%, I would say draw on your cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I obviously agree with that 100%, but I would also add what works for you might change over time. So something that you might find really helpful, like right now, you know, in 6 months' time or a year's time, depending on your context and the context of the world and etc., might not be as useful anymore. So there are sort of some base things that, you know, hopefully are helpful for everyone. But yeah, absolutely, it can change over time, what's important, what's not, and yeah, drawing on those that cultural knowledge as well as the sort of more structural stuff, I think is really important. Another question, and I apologize if I'm not going these in order, but it's a bit difficult for me to see them. Is there any way we can encourage greater uptake of this work so that it becomes a standard aspect of work? That's from Lancy Daly. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We obviously feel quite passionately about this topic and this area, and I think that's part of the reason why we were very keen to develop an online course like this to discuss these issues. I think it's fair to say that issues around sort of trauma and archives and vicarious trauma and archives, they're beginning to be discussed in the literature. I mean, there are some articles, some surveys that have been done of archivists and other workers in the broader GLAM sphere around their experiences of both trauma and more broadly emotion, like feeling emotion of all kinds. But there's certainly less practical tools. And that's certainly, I think, what we were driven by in developing this toolkit. I also think these types of topics are incredibly important to include in archival education, which I know is a whole big issue around, you know, what gets into an archival course, but I think this type of stuff is really critical.
And I think it's fair to say we've certainly had some interest from universities, from other kind of professional associations. There is a lot of discussion happening in this space, in this area. I think the more we can share, the more open we can be about this topic, the more you can read on it, all that type of stuff. Share it with your colleagues. I think that that's only going to help us moving forward, because it is an important topic and one that we do need to continue to raise awareness about. And it is going to take time, because it always takes time. But in the toolkit, there is a lot of reference lists and more further reading that you can do, and that'll really help you see what's already out there and kind of how you can further that discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about sort of normalizing these topics. These are still, I think, for some people or for some workplaces, topics that, you know, are not talked about. And mental health more broadly is obviously still a massive issue that's not addressed well in some workplaces. And so, yeah, I think it's about normalizing it as much as possible.
Yeah. Sorry, also struggling a little bit. Rosalie Powers commented that the biggest challenge she's ever had is when a researcher burst into tears, and she eventually learnt that they were happy tears. And that is something that we do talk about a bit further in the course, that archives can instill a range of emotions. It isn't just traumatic, it isn't just upsetting. They're going to go from that to really happy, really positive. And that's one of the great things about archives. It's just about recognizing all of those levels and responding appropriately.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry,
no, I don't.
Coming through.
I don't really have anything to add to that. I just think it's about really recognising and acknowledging that archives are such powerful sites of emotion and affect, and yeah, emotion of all kinds. And sometimes that's negative, and sometimes that's like really positive. And I think if we can help people through all of those emotional experiences, then that's only a benefit. Somebody, Lindsay Walker, has asked, can you talk more about the work on Indigenous records at UTS? So this is certainly not our area of expertise. Kirsten Thorpe and Lauren Booker and others at the Jumbana Institute, which is part of UTS, have done a lot of work around Indigenous records, Indigenous data sovereignty, and discussions around ideas of cultural competency and that sort of thing. As we said in the presentation, they have developed the Indigenous record keeping and archive toolkit, which should be available fairly soon as well. I believe Kirsten is doing another one of these webinars in a week or so. I'm not sure of the exact date. Next week. So yeah, so if you are interested in that, obviously I'd recommend that you come and see when she speaks, because she will be able to speak about this a lot better than we can.
Definitely. So we've had a question from Angela Schilling. She says, I feel like working with a lot of traumatic Indigenous archives, I often want to consult with my Indigenous colleagues about the best ways to describe or handle the records, but I don't want them to feel trauma from seeing or dealing with these records all the time, or be the only ones that can give advice, but sometimes they are. What do you think is a good medium for this, or is there one? I think that's a great question. I think it's difficult. I think we do talk a little bit about emotional labour in the course, and I think that this touches on that. And actually, Kirsten Thorpe did write a great piece that spoke to these issues. I guess one of the things that we kind of want you to, it's about having the conversation first. It's not just going straight to them with the records open and kind of going, help me. It's about opening the conversation and acknowledging that, yeah, you're there to kind of work with them and really respecting their advice, and that, yeah, that you're looking to use that to grow, and perhaps that you can have a conversation about whether there are some steps that you could regularly follow if it's an occurrence that happens a lot, so that you don't go to them every single time, but you've done a few steps to start with before you then follow up with them. I don't know if you had anything further to say, Kirsten.
Yeah, I think it, again, going back to the principles, especially around sort of choice and collaboration, I think they're really key. You know, so yeah, as Nicola says, sort of talk to the people, you know, see what's appropriate for them at what time, you know, work as much as you can within those, you know, within that, respecting that, and whenever possible, make it a genuine collaboration rather than always you going to seek a particular thing. You know, if you've got that collaborative working relationship, I think that helps a lot. Yes. Okay, this is from Camille Moret, bit of a comment acknowledging the mental health issues and potential vicarious trauma of the archivist may also be a good way to build trust and a positive rapport with the inquirer, which in turn can inform redaction practices when they are still at recommendation stage, at least in my experience. Absolutely, Camille. I think, again, it's about being open and sort of demonstrating that you're a trustworthy person, and sort of being emotionally open as well as sort of factually open. I don't know how to say that. And yeah, I absolutely, and again, it goes back to that collaboration. If you're open about what you're experiencing, they can hopefully be a bit more open about what they're experiencing. And as we sort of spoke about in the presentation, and we go into this in a lot more detail in the course, issues around vicarious trauma do not take away from any other people's trauma. You know, the traumas can exist at the same time. And so yeah, I've sort of heard archivists talk and read some stuff where archivists say, oh, I don't have the right to feel that I'm traumatized because, like, I'm dealing with people who experienced it far worse than I did. They're not mutually exclusive. The two things can exist at the same time. And I think, yeah, if we're open about that, that can really help build rapport with the people you work with, and build trust more broadly within the organization.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So we've got a question from Helen Jarvis. She says, a public institution like a museum will have to deal with viewers who have no direct connection at the same time as people who may get a direct reaction from what is on display. I say this from Cambodia. Today, the 20th of May, is our day of remembrance for the Khmer Rouge regime, and we face these conflicting issues with different audiences. So I think that's a really good point. I think a key thing is you shouldn't be trying to predict what people are going to react to and how they're going to react. It's about having some processes in place, such as a quiet area where people can go if they are having a reaction. And yeah, just kind of thinking through those differences, I guess, in how people will respond. I've certainly, I think it was a presentation from the SAA where they had people from the 9/11 Memorial Museum talking, and they really spoke about these issues really well, and it was yeah, really interesting. So I think this is an important conversation to have about connecting with each other and learning from each other, because there are lots of us going through similar but different situations. And I think there's so much to gain from opening up our networks and having these conversations more openly, because yeah, it is going to be slightly different in a museum setting in comparison to an archival setting, because that's going to be much more likely to be a one-on-one or, you know, a more intimate setting. So yeah, I would definitely say that you can still consider many of the things we talk about in the course, but there's some really interesting readings as well on museums and how they react to yeah, this topic.
Yeah, I think just thinking more generally as well about sort of not predicting how people might react to records is really important. You know, in the presentation, we sort of listed some records that are sort of obvious sites where people might feel trauma, but you just never know who's going to react to what on what day, or what you will react to on what day. And records that someone can find completely blasé and happy to look through, somebody else might be, you know, quite horrified about. That's just life. And I think as well, you know, I've read it, there was a survey earlier this year of PhD researchers doing historical research, and sort of the trauma that they felt in that context of doing historical research. And again, this is not necessarily research that they're personally connected with. These are research topics that they've come up with, you know, for their PhD. And I think it just does go to show that you never know who's going to be affected and how, and that's okay. And then it's about being able to provide that support for everyone who comes through, you know, in the way that you can and in the way that helps them for whatever reason they're there. Yeah.
Just noting the time, I think we'll just do one more question. We'll try and finish in the next couple of minutes, because I know that everyone's yeah, quite busy. Sorry, just trying to check which ones we've responded to. So someone, Christine Hennequins, just commented, like, as an early career professional / volunteer, I'm finding that I experience a range of responses with regards to various situations, collections where I work, things I see on social media, things friends have come across on the web. I find myself sometimes second guessing my responses afterwards, which have been quite varied and contradictory, and this has become a real challenge. I think we've kind of covered a few of, yeah, a little bit about this, is that it is how you react is going to change. As you have these different experiences, you will respond differently. Hopefully, as you can do something like the course to gain a bit more knowledge and things, it'll help you put some strategies in place that will help you deal with challenging situations, so that you've got something to go back to. Having a bit of a process that you can follow if you are feeling a bit triggered can be a good way to ensure that it doesn't escalate too much too quickly or anything, and that yeah, you've got a good support network and a good support setting to make sure that you are able to do your best work.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in the course we do go into quite a bit more detail around sort of triggers and signs of vicarious trauma, and the purpose of that is to help people sort of stop it before it becomes, you know, a really bad situation for everyone. So yeah, I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance today. We really weren't sure how many people would show up, so it's great to see so many of you. Feel free, if you want to talk to Nicola or I, or email us, please. Our details are on the slide. Because I can't help myself, I am going to say, if you are working from home, it might be a fantastic opportunity for you to do the course. If anyone can persuade their employers to let them do that while they're working from home, I think it's a fantastic use of your time. Just thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. And do get in touch if you've got questions.